World War II was the most devastating war in human history. Its ramifications were so large that we can't imagine our modern world without it. No corner of the planet was left untouched by its destruction. So what if it never happened? Removing an event as massive as the Second World War may seem inconceivable, but today, let's conceive it. So how are we going to stop the Second World War from happening? Well, there are a couple of approaches I could take here, and I've decided on one that may not be the most realistic, but I think will be the most interesting scenario. Today we are going to delve into a world in which Neville Chamberlain was actually able to achieve peace in our time in 1938 at the Munich Conference. For context, the Munich Conference was a meeting between Britain, France, Italy, and Germany to discuss the future of Czechoslovakia. The Germans were claiming the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia that held a significant German population. Notably, Czechoslovakia was not invited to this conference. In the end, it was decided that the Germans may take the Sudetenland as long as they promised that their conquest would go no further. Hitler, of course, agreed to this, and proceeded to violate the conditions. Come 1939, the Germans would invade the rest of Czechoslovakia and then Poland. Such invasion would begin the Second World War as Britain and France came to Poland's aid. So what if in an alternative world the Germans truly did stop at the Sudetenland, avoiding the Second World War as we know it? Let's start this scenario off by saying this was never going to happen. Hitler's dreams of world conquest were far too great to stop after the annexation of the Sudetenland. However, for the sake of the scenario, let's suspend our disbelief and say that the Germans decided they had taken enough territory in Europe, and that they were satisfied. What's next? 1939 comes and goes, and the status quo is maintained. Czechoslovakia remains, granted in a smaller state, and no global conflict breaks out. Italy occupies Albania to great protest from Britain and France, however nothing comes of the whole ordeal. And now we come to the Soviet Union. In our timeline, the Soviet Union used the early years of World War II as a distraction, as they conquered much of Eastern Europe. Their first action was to divide Poland with the Germans before proceeding to annex the Baltic states. In this timeline, I believe that the Soviets would still have their eyes on expansion, after watching the Germans take territory without any repercussions. I think these ambitions would begin with the Baltic states. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania would be invaded by the Soviet Union in 1940. I doubt the Western powers would respond to this, however I do think there is a country that would. Poland. Poland was a close ally to the Baltic states and fierce enemy of the Soviet Union. While not impossible, I don't find it likely that the Polish would just allow the Soviets to take the Baltics and would come to their aid. So how would Poland fare against the Union? Well, taking a look into our own timeline, we know that the Soviet military at this point was not in good shape. Having just been thoroughly purged, the Soviets were unable to defeat Finland in our timeline during the Winter War. On the other side of the coin, Poland's military strength during this period is often understated. The Polish genuinely fared quite well against the Germans before the Soviets invaded them in the east. For this reason, I think the Polish would be able to beat back the Soviets and secure Baltic independence, humiliating the Soviet Union. The Baltics would become de jure subjects of Poland, which would have asserted itself as a regional power. Now, being realistic, the Germans would never pass up this chance to strike the Polish from the west when they were fighting the Soviets. However, for the sake of the scenario, let's say that they don't. As the 1940s continued, things would begin to become interesting. It was around this time that Mussolini had predicted in our own timeline that Italy would be prepared to fight the West. For this reason, I believe the major threat of the 1940s would be Italy. The Italians would begin to threaten Yugoslavia and Greece, and perhaps even Turkey. Tensions would boil over in the late 1940s with an Italian invasion of Yugoslavia. I believe with guarantees of neutrality from the Germans, France and Britain would intervene. Italy would have its navy sunk, African holdings occupied, and eventually forced to sign a white peace. This embarrassment would likely see the end of Mussolini's reign, being deposed by leftist forces. Before moving on, let's shift our focus to the east. Japan would have still conducted its invasion of China. However, without the distraction in Europe and the fall of France, I don't believe Japan would expand its war into Indochina. This was the overstep that forced the Americans' hand, cutting off Japan's oil, an act that would lead to Pearl Harbor and the Pacific theater of the Second World War. Japan would be slowly bogged down in China until eventually they would be forced to withdraw to Manchuria in exchange for economic and territorial concessions. The Japanese monarchy and military fascist government would continue, however, and would position itself as Asia's predominant power. Continuing forward, let's talk about colonialism. By this point, European colonialism had stood for centuries, fueled by European technological advancement and a sense of pride. World War I certainly put a damper on this pride. However, it was the Second World War that left the Europeans unable to continue this system. From the 1950s onward, the world would go through the process of decolonization. Africa and Asia would finally see itself independent from European rule, at least directly. However, in this timeline, there was no Second World War to drain the coffers of Europe. Therefore, this system of colonialism would not fall so easily. African and Indian independence movements would rise, and Europeans would stand firm. By the late 1950s and 1960s, I see it likely that armed rebellions would begin to break out. The question is whether or not Europeans would be able to keep their grip over their empires. I find that it could be plausible, with coordination and effort, Europe could put down these rebellions. However, slowly they would begin to ramp up. New technology would begin to spread into the European colonial holdings, and senses of nationalism would begin to rise more and more. Europe's empires would become bloodbaths, as the powers desperately attempt to maintain control. To what extent they would go, I don't know, but I could see things getting very, very grim. Rewinding and refocusing on Europe, we find a very interesting political landscape. In Britain, the status quo would likely remain. However, in France and Germany, things would get interesting. The French Third Republic was very unstable, quite comparable to the Weimar Republic in Germany, actually. Economic hardship, brawls in the streets, etc. France maintaining its democracy is far from certain. Perhaps it would fall to right-wing or left-wing forces. In Germany, things get a lot darker. The Nazis would be free to execute their horrific policies within the borders of Germany unimpeded. Without a world war, I think they would prioritize the expulsion of ethnic minorities rather than the extermination. However, anyone that nowhere would take could find themselves inducted into a system of forced labor. I find it likely that Hitler would begin aging and deteriorating into the 1950s. This raises the question of what would come after his inevitable demise. I am a firm believer that the Nazi economic and political system could not survive without Hitler. Beyond his death, reform would need to occur. Perhaps some form of limited democracy would return, with Hitler being deified within Germany, which would stand as somewhat of a sleeping giant of military power. By this time, the Soviets would have recovered militarily from the purges, and economically they would be outperforming their counterpart of our timeline. They would support any communist movements in Europe and the colonized world. A Cold War would begin between the Soviets and Americans, who would be forced to back the Europeans in their colonial ambitions. While there would be no Second World War, the Global South would descend into a battleground between imperialist and left-wing forces. The death and devastation would be great. And it's here that we leave this world. By the modern times, nearly nothing of the political landscape would be recognizable. I may make a part 2 of this video exploring how each corner of the world would be affected by the lack of a Second World War. But as of now, I leave you to ponder if this timeline would truly be a better one.